Thank you all for coming. My name is Yvette Pastel and I work in the Adult Programs Department here at the Rogers Memorial Library. And before we get started, I want to first thank Canios, who was kind enough to bring some books tonight. And we really are appreciative that they made the trip here for that. And the author will be available at the end too for signing if anyone would like. I'd like to give a special thank you to David Alpern, who has been a great friend of our library over the years. And he's responsible for putting us in touch with the author who's our guest tonight. So just a few words about David, and he will introduce our guest.
After, there'll be a time after.
So, getting back to David. David Alpern reported, wrote, or edited at the New York Post, the Daily Journal of Elizabeth, New Jersey, United Press International, and Newsweek magazine, running the Newsweek On Air and For Your Ears Only network radio shows for 3 decades. He now reviews books for East Hampton Star, and he presents programs like this one. He's done a number of fabulous ones for us here at the library, and we are thrilled to have him here. Please welcome David Alpern.
Thanks, Yvette. Thanks to you all for coming this evening, and to all who might be watching this conversation later at the Rogers Memorial Library YouTube site, which many of the programs that they do here are online and available free of charge, and eat what you like. And of course, special thanks to Professor Zelizer for joining us to discuss his latest book with a unique perspective on American politics, past, present, and possibly future, provocatively titled In Defense of Partisanship. A New York Times bestselling author, Julian E. Zelizer is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton, a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, creator of an internet Substack, newsletter, and podcast called The Long View, which we all must now be taking. A regular guest on LPR's Here and Now and on multiple other radio and TV networks, Professor Zelizer is the award-winning author or editor of 27 books, including The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society, and Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party, which was an editor's choice at the Times and one of its 100 notable books in 2020, and a good look into the future at that point. I reviewed it for the East Hampton Star. I had the pleasure of discussing it with Julian for the library here via Zoom during the COVID pandemic. He is editor of the first historical assessment of the Biden presidency, co-author of Myth America, MYTH, Historians Take on the Biggest Lies and Legends About Our Past. Also has published over 1,500 op-ed columns, and along the way found time to buy a home in San Jose. There will be time for your questions after our Q&A, and there should be copies of In Defense of Partisanship for sale and signing. So now, welcome, Professor.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
My first question is about your latest book's title.
Yes.
Did you or the publisher worry that it might seem to put you in the camp of chaos that so many see in today's often bitter two-party politics? In the book, you call partisanship a dirty word in American politics now. Why, and so why defend it?
So thank you, first of all. And I've been talking to David for a long time. He used to interview me on my radio show, on his radio show, and that's where we got to know each other. And always just a great interviewer. So thank you for having me here. And his reviews are amazing. They're really substantive and thoughtful, and he should be commended. The book title is intentionally provocative, and I've studied national politics my whole career, and I've been very interested in parties. There was a long period in the 20th century where people wanted stronger parties. The major complaint was parties were too weak, they were too watered down. In the 60s and 70s, if you talk to any civil rights activists, what they wanted was a party that stood for something rather than a party that watered everything down the compromise. So it's been on my mind for a while. And I wanted to distinguish the kind of partisanship that is going on right now in parts of American politics from an institution that historically has been incredibly important to making this fragmented, disjointed system function. And it's a history, it's a kind of intellectual history of why some people thought parties were good, such as Woodrow Wilson, to kind of take on where we are today, and are there ways to rein in the worst excesses and have what I call a responsible partisanship that represents the differences in our country and offers voters a way to express those in a system that's still functional. So the publisher was aware. The publishers love provocative titles, so I don't think that's a problem for them. But I did want to kind of capture people's attention to think differently on something that seems so conventional at this point.
The first line in the review was, "Of course not." But let's go back to the beginning. Remind us of early warnings about party politics from the nation's founding fathers, not least G. Washington himself.
Yeah, I mean, we've been fearing partisanship since the founding. The founders were very scared of it. James Madison designs a constitution in part to avoid faction and avoid partisan division. That's the modern way to think about it. George Washington, in his farewell address, was very scared of what factionalism would do to the country. That said, parties form right after the Republic starts. And it was inevitable. The divisions emerged very quickly, and it was clear that these institutions were going to be part of our future. So the anti-party sentiment is very much part of American culture from the founding through today, but so too are parties. And I think that says a lot about why we have leaned on them.
You write, ideals were one thing, reality was another. Talk about how the parties began, how they took to their relative positions, the roles they assumed. You cite, quote, the organizational potential, unquote, seen by such as Senator, later President Martin Van Buren, creator of the infamous New York Democratic machine.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different parts of this. Some is what Van Buren saw was that parties could bring together this very messy institutional system that we put together with the Constitution. They could connect. They could be a connective tissue between voters and politicians, between politicians and state politics and federal politics. And he was very instrumental in the kind of organizational muscle of what parties would look like. There is also an intellectual argument that what parties provide is not simply a way to make things work, but if they work well, they can be a source of big ideas in American politics. This is post Van Buren. They could be a source in moments of crisis, of leading the country, and they can be a source of allowing the divisions that we have to express themselves within politics rather than outside. And many would argue the Civil War became a total breakdown when the parties were no longer handling the issues of the day.
How did they first, or around what principles or issues did they, was it regional mostly, was it economic, what were the organizing factors as the parties developed?
Well, it changes. So, you know, early on, foreign policy is a kind of big part of the tension over U.S. relations with different countries, England and France. By the mid-19th century, you're starting to get a regionally based party where Democrats are really centered on protecting the slaveholding republic. And then the Whigs and then the Republicans form as an oppositional element to that. Through the 20th century, they're not what they are today. They're fragmented. Like a Democrat in the mid-20th century is someone who is in a party where Southern Democrats are representing, protecting Jim Crow and protecting the kind of non-union element of the region. And a Democrat was a Hubert Humphrey, who was a champion of racial progress and liberalism. So they were coalitional. And then in the Republican Party, you had the same divisions by mid-20th century. You had Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, the Senate Minority Leader, who was very much against government, didn't want high taxes, And then you had a Jacob Javits here in New York, by today's standards would probably be a social democrat. So in the mid-20th century, they were coalitional, certainly on Capitol Hill.
There was also, and I found this one of the most fascinating parts of your book, a social factor. By the late 1800s, you explain, parties came with real partying and hoopla, especially at election time. So talk about that. I mean, the word is so, has so many facets.
We don't think of parties that way, but in the 19th century, political parties were part of popular culture, meaning there's great histories of how people would attend rallies and drink, and a lot of drinking, a lot of alcohol. But to go to see someone speak, to go to rally behind the Democrats or Republicans was akin to going to a rock concert today. And it wasn't simply the events that people went to. It was very much part of family tradition, which party you were part of. You identified that way as who you were. So what the argument is, what we've lost, and I argue we need to find our way back. We had strong parties in the 19th century as organizations, but they were very much connected to all of us, to the citizens. And some of that has thinned over time.
I remember hearing about the Democratic Party and, the party providing coal scuttles. I mean, really providing a service to people, besides an organizing principle. Voting itself was part of the public spectacle. Talk about those open public procedures, the power they gave to parties and local leaders before the secret ballot was accepted.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a romantic vision. There is an underside, meaning, so in the 19th century, rates of voting, it's very high for national elections. Presidential elections, you get over 90% of eligible voters voting. Of course, many were disenfranchised. And in city politics, which is what David is talking about, not only would you be voting, but you'd be voting by putting your ballot that was marked who you were voting for right in front of the party boss. And that is the reason in the progressive era we moved to what's called the Australian ballot. And the reason for secrecy is so that voting wouldn't be a form of intimidation, which it very much was. But in exchange, parties did provide jobs, they provided patronage, they very much were key institutions in the lives of immigrants, for example, in the early 20th century.
Still, as you've noted, the two-party system was not able to bridge a north-south divide that produced the Civil War, nor prevent physical violence that became, quote, a regular occurrence on the floors of Congress. Talk about that division and that violence.
Yeah, I mean, the two times you see a real breakdown, the biggest is the 19th century. And by the time the Civil War hits, the slavery issue is not being resolved. And there's a historian, Joanne Friedman, who wrote a great book that violence is prevalent on the floor of the House and Senate. We're not talking about yelling at each other. We're talking about incidents where there's, actual attacks. And it wasn't Canes. There's a famous case involving Charles Sumner, who's beaten on the floor, but it turns out that was not an anomaly. And people would have pistols, they'd have weapons. So there was a breakdown of how parties were functioning and a breakdown of the party, because the system couldn't solve the problem of the day. And then the other time, I would argue, it's not as severe, but by the mid-20th century, the parties as constituted were not solving the problem of the era, which was racial justice. And by the 1950s and 1960s, the frustration many civil rights leaders had was there wasn't strong partisanship, meaning on Capitol Hill, Midwestern Republicans were perpetually teaming up with Southern Democrats to block every civil rights bill that came their way. James Eastland, the senator from Mississippi, used to joke that he had pockets put in his pants just to put all the bills he would never let up for a vote on the floor. The filibuster was a weapon that Southerners used to make sure that nothing could get through. So that's why by the 70s you have an actual regeneration of partisanship, in part a response to those failures.
Well, I want to take a step back again. By 1891, secret voting had become a hallmark of American democracy, and it did cut election violence, intimidation, bribery, and party power. It also paved the path to the progressive era and set the stage for a young Southerner, Princeton and Johns Hopkins grad, Woodrow Wilson, later the nation's 28th president. What was Wilson's critique of American democracy, the thesis of this graduate treatise he wrote in 1885, which actually became a game plan for our politics.
Yeah, I mean, he argues, Wilson, in his dissertation, which becomes a book, Congressional Government, argues that by the late 19th century, Congress is too fragmented, that the parties have no power, that basically you have lots of fiefdoms on Capitol Hill of committee leaders who did whatever they wanted. And so he argued that there needed to be a restoration of strong parties on Capitol Hill as parliamentary systems in Europe had. And so he wanted a Speaker of the House who could basically hold sway over every member of the party. And if you were going to vote in a way that didn't fit what the party wanted, you would be punished. You would lose your committee seat, you wouldn't get campaign funding. And so his first book, he writes 2 books. The first book is very much, can we import some system? The second, go back a second. The second critique was there was no coordination between the president and his party allies on Capitol Hill. So it was another source of fragmentation. So he wanted something akin to what England had, a parliamentary system where the president was literally appointing cabinet officials right out of Congress who could coordinate action. And about 10, 20 years later, I'm working on another book, so the timing isn't perfect. He writes another book, and he's more saying the president should be the center of the party. So centralize the party under the president. So he very much believed that a country that could deal with issues like industrialization and urbanization needed strong parties. That if we didn't have that in this political system, we would essentially be dysfunctional.
But the process, as I read it, was a continuing cycle of reform, regulation, deregulation.
Right.
Talk about that and how that came to be and what kept it in that cyclical nature.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's no line from, the Constitution to today. We go through different variations. So by the late 19th century, ironically, when Wilson publishes his critique of parties not being strong enough, parties are becoming incredibly strong. Members of the party are voting almost on the same page on every issue on Capitol Hill. Voters are very loyal to the parties. And then you go in the early 20th century, what's called the progressive era, into this period where reformers are saying middle-class reformers' parties are corrupt, we have to weaken parties, and so they pass all these reforms, like the secret ballot, to weaken the power of parties and to put more power in the hands of experts and commissions. And then we'll move back. Parties will restore a lot of their power on Capitol. So we fluctuate. Although since the 70s, we have moved in a direction of stronger and stronger partisanship without much of a break.
I was fascinated in an earlier biography, maybe Carol, but when Lyndon Johnson was ruling the Senate, I mean, funds raised went to him.
Yep.
And he dispersed them. I mean, they went through the party, and that gave incredible importance. We'll talk later about the reforms that have spread that money around so that it can come from all corners.
Yep.
And that was one of the big weakenings of party power, that the party was not the source or the sole source of financing.
Yeah, I mean, what you're referring to is Lyndon Johnson. Caro writes about how one of the ways he gains power is to gain hold over money that's then distributed to candidates. And that's traditionally in the United States been how parties command power, money, and giving money. But what we've seen, parties have retained that power. In Congress, one of the ways the party leaders, the speaker, the majority leader have power is they have the power of the purse over candidates. They control what's called like the DCCC, the institution that hands out money to candidates. So do you want to cross the leadership that is going to say, oh, your funds are going to run dry next election? The issue is, though, they now raise their money from a much broader range of very sophisticated interest groups and organizations that insist in exchange for their donation to the party, they want something in return.
But the reforms have also included permission for sources to provide money to candidates outside the parties, and
Yes.
that's another one of the weakening of parties, that they're not the sole source of
Dark-
money. It's dark money.
Dark money.
Yeah. And there have been Supreme Court rulings, and so that is now part of the system that is outside parties and inimical to them. Let's go back to what you said. In a truly democratic system, as I read you, partisanship requires real parties, coherent in thought and goals, capable of defining and debating problems and priorities, developing broadly acceptable solutions, mobilizing and inspiring partisans in common cause. Let's talk about how our two major parties today measure up to that goal. I will go first. I see Democrats today as increasingly a loose collection of party factionalists driven by their own particular priorities: abortion, health care, gender assignment and reassignment, the poor and marginalized, Israel, the Palestinians, the Ukraine, prices at the pump and the grocery. Now also divided generationally, with younger leaders arguing that the party would be more appealing if elder powers moved on and out. As for the Republicans, even overarching loyalty to President Trump had to struggle for congressional approval of the big, beautiful budget. And now we read there's roiling over campaign promises unkept or reversed, high prices, attacking Iran, not releasing all the files on suicide sex abuser Jeffrey Epstein. So what's your view of the party?
Wow, you managed to get Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, there'll be more. There'll be more. They won't let it go.
So I think there's two things. The parties are very different, and I do think the Democrats are much more fragmented and coalitional now than Republicans are, even with the differences you talked about. The reality is the party on Capitol Hill votes in unison almost all the time. The complaints happen and then Senator Murkowski moves on. And even in the electorate, you see in Republican politics relative stability. And I think President Trump is a test case, because if anyone would kind of shake and move the Republican electorate, it would be him. Whatever you think of him, he's certainly controversial and kind of unstable in the way he leads, and yet the numbers stay pretty stable. And the differences within the Republican Party, there are differences. There are some issues, such as Russia, although that's switching as we speak, in terms of what the position is. There's general, if you look at roll call votes on Capitol Hill, there's not huge fissures that take place. And even this budget bill, I mean, that was yet another test. Republicans ended up generally going along despite all these tensions. Democrats are not quite as unified. I think we can talk about the different kinds of partisanship we see in Washington. They have more serious tensions. That said, if you compare the party today to the 1950s, it's much more united. Even the fissures that emerged over the Middle East or transgender issues are not the hard divisions, the fault lines that we saw in the 50s between Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. It's not, back then, Senator Eastland and Hubert Humphrey were essentially from two different universes when you talked about should we have a civil rights bill that ends segregation. I don't think it's quite that severe. So even in the Democratic Party, it's a much more united party.
Well, we mentioned the impact of dark money from special interests, direct messaging from all corners of the social media. I mean, it used to be the parties would be the organization that would tell their participants or their followers who to vote for, what the issues were. Now, everybody gets everything from everywhere, and mostly they get what they want to hear. So,
I mean, it's the brokenness of the parties now moves, there's two different parts of it, and they actually are moving in different directions, so it's more intimidating. Meaning, on the one hand, I would argue, and I do argue in the book, part of the story is that the GOP since the 1980s has embraced a kind of hyper-partisanship, a partisanship without guardrails, which I trace from Newt Gingrich to President Trump, that fundamentally destabilizes the political system. It's a partisanship without boundaries. And that makes governing incredibly difficult, and it also creates risks and threats to democratic institutions. And I do think the parties are not the same. I think Republican politics, whatever your party, embraces a much more aggressive kind of partisanship than Democrats have done. And you can see the last election, the difference between a Biden, which was the choice of Democrats, and a Trump. Very different styles of partisanship. So one problem that people have is this hyper-partisanship and what it does. The other is at the same time, the parties are somewhat kind of weak and enfeebled internally on certain issues. And one is messaging. It's harder, there is no public commons anymore, so it's harder for a president
Or a
to
very
command the
public
state.
commons, and super
Or,
public.
right, but it's a fragmented commons. I tell my students that in the 1960s, when you had divisions over Vietnam, the division was, do you support America's involvement there, or do you support withdrawing? Today, if we were having a war in Vietnam, the debate would be, some would say we're not having a war in Vietnam, nothing's happening over there. And others would be like, but we have tens of thousands of troops. And that's a very different kind of space to inhabit. And related to that, parties are also very strong, and people feel very intensely loyal, even if they complain about parties, they still vote the party line. But there's weaker connections to parties as institutions. Those old rallies, those old parades, that sense of identity is not as strong. It's a thin kind of partisan attachment. So it pulls in different directions, but both, I think, created a much more combustible system right now.
In the end, you suggest more congressional reforms to foster responsible partisanship. So we'd like to see what that looks like. Some particular steps you propose and the results you hope for, starting with stopping or significantly minimizing filibusters.
Yeah, so this was the hardest chapter of the book. It's a short book. It's meant for a public audience, just to give you a kind of overview and understanding of why we've had parties. In the last chapter, my editor, who's a guy named Nick Lemon, who's a journalist for the New Yorker, and he edits this series, he said you need to put reforms in there, like what do you propose, which is not what I do. I'm a historian. But I tried it, and it was interesting to write. So some of the reforms are procedural, and one, I do believe, and no one ever wants to do it, because at the moment you're talking about something like filibuster reform, inevitably half the country wants the filibuster. But I do think at a minimum, curtailing how frequently the filibuster can be used is important. We now have a Senate where you either have a 60-vote majority required, supermajority, on any bill, which is impossible to get, or you conduct business through this reconciliation process, which is a totally terrible way to handle public policy. It's full of gimmicks, it's not transparent. We just passed the biggest increase in domestic policing in American history, $8 billion to $170 billion for immigration enforcement. I don't think I read a single story about this until after it happened. And in part, it's a process where things are headed. So I'm a believer in filibuster reform. I think overall, it's something that the parties actually have used in destructive ways to block legislation, and at a minimum, carving out certain areas of policy, lowering the number of senators needed to end a filibuster. Those are healthy. I don't believe that this kind of budget ceiling that we have is useful for the country anymore. This was something put into place in the early 20th century, and where Congress every year has to vote to pay for what they've already agreed to pay for. But it's become a weapon now where we go to the brink of sending the country into default several times since 2011. And I think you have to take some of these weapons away. Another, I'll just...
While you're on debt ceiling, because you talk about that, and then there is a way you propose to bypass the debt ceiling.
Well, there's
crisis.
There's several ways, and I mean, one is to put more of the responsibility on the president, which many members would agree, in terms of approving what Congress has already approved of doing. Another, there's mechanisms the Secretary of Treasury can have to circumvent a crisis should it happen. We actually had a reform. No one even remembers this. We had a debt ceiling that was not raised in time in 1979. It was an accident. Like Congress was tied up in battle and the clock stopped ticking, and we fixed it right away. But a legislator named Richard Gephardt, a Missouri Democrat, got a reform passed which essentially made sure that we could never default, that would not happen, that there'd be an automatic kick-in to prevent a debt ceiling crisis. And who got rid of it? Newt Gingrich, becoming Speaker in '95, got rid of that right away. So I think that's a mechanism that is no longer useful. Then I have one other area so we can move forward. I do talk about something more abstract, and I know people are going to say, how do you, not you, I mean, people think, how are you ever going to get that? But I do think there needs to be new norms of leadership in this country. And I think we need norms of responsible partisanship. We need a generation of politicians who can be tough, who can represent real differences in whatever issue you are focused on, but who understand, as politicians did for many generations, that the responsibilities of governing, the responsibilities of protecting the institutions are also part of the job. And I think we need leaders who can show how this is done. And that's going to also be, it's the most amorphous, but also an important reform.
You also talk about tighter limits on campaign spending and independent political spending, which have weakened the power of the parties and are really an alternative influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think the money problem is a huge problem in American politics. One of the amazing things with the Elon Musk story was how much of the story of his role in politics was focused on cutting federal workforce numbers, which was very significant. But just the fact you had the richest person in the world in an unappointed position with so much influence after having donated lots of money to the campaign was a money in politics problem that really got very little attention and is striking, in my opinion, and reflects a bigger problem. So what do you do about it? And that's a hard one. We've tried to, look, after Watergate, we actually had a public finance system for presidential elections that lasted through George W. Bush and Obama, both of whom abandoned it. But for many decades, it actually worked. It limited private money in presidential elections. I think we need to strengthen some of those Watergate reforms, including contribution limits and dealing with dark money. But the biggest area people are excited about in campaign finance reform is encouraging small donations. And some states have made, and cities have made progress on this. And some presidential campaigns, including President Trump, have actually shown you can raise a lot of money, but little amounts. And I think that's healthy. I think it's healthy to have small donations over big organizations. And I think it's a way to invest people in our times in campaigns and in parties.
And one of the ways you talk about encouraging it is with small matching grants for small donations.
That's been the major mechanism, and some cities have put that into place. And the matching grants then give candidates a reason to encourage that kind of donation rather than going to organization X and bundling a huge amount of money.
The other thing that stood out to me was your proposal to enlarge the House of Representatives. Why and how?
That was interesting. I read a lot about that as I was writing it, and the basic problem that supporters of that reform, and I have now gone in that camp, is that we have not enlarged the House since the early 20th century, and the country is huge. So the effect is you have members going back to districts that are not going to interact with voters on a regular basis. It's unwieldy, and whether you're red or blue in terms of your party, it doesn't matter. It's a very impossible situation. If you increase the size of the House, which is constitutional, and also which we now know can be handled architecturally, a scholar named Daniel Allen did a whole study on this. You could have smaller districts where I think members could have more meaningful contact with their constituents, where members can have a better sense of what's going on in the district and could be better party representatives, and also hopefully have to raise less money for congressional campaigns which are out of control at this point. All of us know these Long Island races, it's astounding how much has to be raised to run in one district.
Well, this is a bit repetitious, but you did say procedural and organizational reforms won't be sufficient. You talk about, the individuals But how do you bring them up to a higher form of responsible leadership when the party systems, and especially the Republican Party system, has become more cult-like, whereas it almost doesn't make any difference what the issues are. Trump changes his mind, his followers basically change it, although there are, some fault lines showing. So is it, the word cult comes up all the time. Is it a party? Is it partisanship? Or is it something that's sort of less rational than partisanship?
Well, I think I'm thinking it's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer. And I don't think anyone who tells you they do really does. But one thing I know from studying American history is you don't see the great leaders before they get to where they are. I think if you look back at FDR as an example, who my wife is writing a big book about, if you look at what he did for the country, what he did for the party, you didn't know that was going to be FDR 10 years earlier. Ronald Reagan, you saw there was something there. You saw in 1964 when he cut an ad for Barry Goldwater or something special in his delivery, or in 1976, but you didn't see. Even in 1978 and 79, he would transform Republican politics and conservatism. Same with Obama. I think you could make a similar argument. And so you don't see it coming. So I don't know, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Second, I do think there's a generational dynamic to some of this. Sometimes the great leaders emerge when the older leaders and the older system has broken down. And we now have a generation, if you think about it, they're coming of age, they've lived through COVID, a total kind of destructive moment. They are living through really unstable national political moment with this presidency. So I wouldn't be surprised if you have younger Democrats where the division isn't just, are you social Democrat or a Tea Party or a MAGA Republican, but are you for a more effective system that will handle all these issues that young people in their 20s are not seeing addressed. And I do believe there's room for that. The final is, look, parties respond to losses. And so right now, if you had asked me this question in 2022, I think there was a chance that the Republican Party could change, that you were going to see new leadership coming up. The history moved in a different direction. But when parties lose, and they lose systematically over a couple cycles, space opens for new kinds of leadership, and that certainly can happen. The final thing I'd say, I wrote a book on the 1970s years ago, which is really a high point of reform. And it's like the progressive era. There's disclosure, campaign finance. We changed national security in response to Vietnam, Watergate, and the corruption of the year. But if you had asked in the 60s, was the reform going to happen? People would have said no. Like, who's going to give up power? And then it happened. Crisis opened opportunity. So I've studied enough to know not to predict it will never happen. And I think we need to just look for generational change.
Moving from your book to things that are in the news.
Yep.
Was the Kamala Harris loss due more to the lack of time she had thanks to Biden's overly delayed withdrawal, or the lack of distance she was able to put between herself, him, and his compromised image? Not that he didn't warn her to stay loyal, according to one of the several new books published about the 2024 election.
Great question. And the great thing about being a historian is even when you're talking about the present, you can say all of the above. So part of the answer is I think people underestimated the strength of President Trump and the campaign. And I think they underestimated his hold on the Republican Party, his ability to attract voters who were not participants, and his understanding of the news media. We have to put that in the storyline. And I think it was an important story. And I was just in the events that happened, including the assassination. I was just reading. I'm reading the latest book. And I'm going to get to the Harris fight in a second. I'm reading the latest book, 2024, that just came out, and there's one passage which I found amazing. It was after he was convicted. He was he was upset. It wasn't like he didn't care about it. And his campaign manager the guy who did the Swift vote at Savit, I'm forgetting his name. But he's instantly wants to start tweeting nasty things about anyone who says anything negative about the conviction. And one of the people who has said something is Larry Hogan from Maryland, who's running for the Senate, who's a moderate Republican. And he says, I think he sent out a tweet or something, Hogan, saying everyone should abide by the court's rulings and we have to respect it. So Trump's team is furious. How could a Republican not just attack the ruling? And Trump says, hold back on what you say about him. We need that seat. That's not a Trump that's not thinking or savvy. And I think this is a part of what we missed, many people missed. Secondly, I think the books make clear that the state of the campaign for President Biden was disastrous by the summer. All the books reached the same conclusion. The polls weren't that he was going to lose. The polls were you were going to have a Republican landslide election as we have not had since 1984, and you were going to have huge majorities in the Senate and the House. Many Democrats in safe seats were getting consistent information that they were going to lose. That was what kind of triggered all the fear within the Democratic Party, even before the debate, which changed everything. So I think it was a weak campaign. I think Harris actually boosted it significantly. You can't prove negatives, but I think where it ended up was much better. She picked up a campaign that was in a hole. And then she had a month to put a campaign together, which in modern politics is very difficult to do, especially against an incumbent. But the final part is what you said. So there's a book by Amy Parnes and John Allen. It was the first one to come out. And one of their big arguments, and all the books subsequently have repeated this, was the Biden campaign was, after he stepped out, pretty ruthless in making clear to the Harris team that she could not break with his record. She could not criticize his record. So they put her in a situation, a little like Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson, where Humphrey had the baggage of Vietnam and couldn't really say what he thought. And this was not Vietnam, I don't mean to say that, but she was kind of saddled with the incumbent's problems. And I don't know, but all the books have the same story at this point from different sources. She couldn't free herself. In that interview, she could not go out there and say, I'm doing something different. So I do think that harmed the campaign a lot. And again, I think she got it. Once you read these books, you say, boy, I can't believe it ended that well for the Democrats, including the congressional outcome, given where things were.
Can the Democrats also be excused for reading into the 2022 midterms?
Yes.
That there were trends in their directions, that the issues of abortion, that women's issues, I mean, that it was not imaginary. They did.
No, I think the other scenario most of these books point out is you have many serious candidates who were gearing up to run before the midterms. The assumption was he was not going to run. Everyone from the Illinois governor to the Michigan governor, they were seriously getting ready for a campaign. And the mistake of 2022 was not that Democrats didn't have a lot of issues that were favorable. I think you could argue the mistake was that Biden should be the candidate to run on them. And he couldn't do it. And I mean, I urge all of you to read these books. I'm not speaking as someone, this wasn't like my cause, but the books are very damaging in terms of where he was by 2023, in terms of his capacity. And I think he just couldn't run this campaign.
So you were working for CNN at the time.
Yeah.
What were you hearing about the real state of Biden? Were you?
I mean, I was just an analyst, and that's what I do, so I don't get any inside scoop. But I think a lot of the public was pretty savvy. I mean, I don't think the problem was a total secret, and all the polls show that. So you didn't have to be at a network to know there was an issue there. I think, I don't know what reporters knew or didn't know. You know, reporters claim, I mean, part of these books also is that it was protected how bad it was from a lot of reporters in the public. Meaning, you saw he was older, you saw he was struggling, but they were very, if you put out, so the guy who wrote the book with Jake Tapper, No, but the guy who wrote with him, Thompson, he said he put out a story early on, and when he did about the age and raising the question, that they came after him with hammers and tongs. They started attacking his credibility, the Biden people. And I've kind of seen this now in many of the accounts. So I think that's probably how it unfolded. And I don't know. I don't think, look, if reporters have a good story in this day and age, they're going to get it out there. So I just don't believe they were hiding something very explosive. I don't think they had this information yet.
And what about the reports questioning the current president's physical and mental state? His rants, scrambled syntax, maybe a catheter, and the conditions it might require?
I would argue if that's not the main issue, meaning you can evaluate him. The issue is what he's doing. The issue is the policies. And I think a debate that ends up is kind of President Trump dealing with versions of what President Biden had. They're important. I believe we should know everything about presidents. I'm a transparency guy. But for me, that's just not the main question. For me, the main question is the deportation and detentions. For me, the main question is the attack on education. For me, the main question is the tariffs and trade and foreign policy. That's where the debate has to be at. And finally, the use of presidential power. That's the issue with him. And I don't know what his state is. I mean, he definitely seems strong physically, but the issue is the deployment of presidential power is something that would even make President Nixon wince at this point. And I think that's a big issue for our country. With a Supreme Court that, lest you think the Supreme Court will stop this, is fully on board that 6-person majority with another ruling as we were on our way that will consistently support a very expansive use of presidential power. That's the issue. So the others are the questions I'm just not as worried about or thinking about quite as much.
Well, in that vein, some Democrats say their problem now is mostly just one of messaging, finding the right words or pictures to the young, to former Democrats and Black, Latino, other minority groups. Others call for reformulating underlying policies and priorities. And still others are more looking at this generational thing that they think is making them unappealing.
I think you just listed 3 problems that the Democrats are struggling from. I do think it's not, look, the last one, there are new Democrats emerging. I mean, I think a lot of the governors, they're certainly of a younger generation. That's the generation that gives rise to the next leadership. And there's some exciting governors if you're a Democrat. We're gaining a lot of traction in the states. We're much more savvy, not just in terms of policy, but communicating. I think the party, at least the leaders, the senior leaders in Washington do have a communications problem. They are still talking network television, and they're not talking the world that exists of podcasting and social media. And even when they try it, what's amazing is they still try to do the old style on the new media. And so I do think the party needs to really reimagine how they're going to communicate the issues. And finally, I do think they have a policy problem. I think on a lot of policies, Democrats have a lot of support, frankly. So I don't think it's a total collapse. And I would argue that some issues, like the environment, they're in much stronger standing with the public than where the Republicans are. But on economic questions, certainly there's a lot of space right now for Democrats to do much more to deal with working and middle-class Americans who just feel that every week is a struggle. Not that the Republicans are going to help, because this bill is not geared for that, but they can't just argue that. And I don't think that kind of issue area is as strong. Immigration, I'm more mixed. I mean, I think Democrats probably kind of ignored the problems that were mounting in terms of costs, in particular social services. But I don't know, I'm skeptical Democrats should go. I think their argument about immigration, a general argument about the positives of immigration, also has a lot of strength in our country. And I think Democrats would actually make a mistake to abandon it and go all in on kind of a Trumpian vision, because I think that can be an asset. I think you're seeing some reaction to the detentions and to the removal of people who you know or who you encounter, and it rubs against kind of what this country is about.
Well, even Trump has taken the interest of the farmers and realized that, this is an important part of our economy. It wasn't enough in 2024, but is there now enough so that Democrats could exploit dramatic loss of government jobs, loss of contracts, which is private jobs, loss of experience, arguably lost lives because of so much downsizing in health and human services, the CDC, even now the National Weather Service.
Well, could they and will they are two different questions. So, could they? Yes. I mean, there are amazing vulnerabilities that the kind of first few months of this administration have put on the table that a Democrat could exploit. And obviously, the big, beautiful bill is the most glaring example of where there is a disconnect, total disconnect, between what the Republicans just passed and the promise of the MAGA coalition. Meaning, this is a bill that redistributes income, that 10 to 12 million people are about to lose health coverage. And rural hospitals are going to close. It's not hysterical to say that. The data is very clear. And food stamps that go to the very populations that voted for President Trump. All of this just belies the notion that conservative populism is going to tackle these issues. That said, the will they, it's not simply are Democrats effective. I'm not convinced anymore that there's an automatic connection between what a politician does and how voters respond. Meaning the electoral connection that is so powerful in American politics is weaker than it used to be. Because of how the media works, I do think it's harder to follow stories, there's more disinformation, and partisanship, the final thing, I think makes it harder to move a voter, even if they can see right in front of them that the policies are not in their interest.
I mean, would it be impractical, self-defeating to say, how many people in your family, among your neighbors, among your friends, has lost a job, has lost a relative because of medical conditions that were not being sufficiently treated? I mean, can they make a personal thing about it, or has Trump delayed the worst of it enough past midterms that it will still be imaginary as opposed to real losses by real people?
Yeah, so the Medicaid cuts are not going into effect until after the midterms intentionally, even though there's lots of stories about what's around the corner, and I think you're right. I mean, with immigration, it's happening right now, and I mean, I've seen enough stories, and they're just the stories you have all seen about red communities that are really not happy with the kind of human toll of what is going on right now. You basically have roundups happening just to meet numbers. It's not about
By
borders.
masked men with no...
Yeah, and the borders are actually secure right now. No one's coming through. And so I think it is different. And I think some of this is real. With jobs, you're right. I mean, right now his economic bets are paying off. That's the reality. Unemployment has not shifted. Inflation is still relatively contained. We don't know what's going to happen. So it would be more to people not like kind of the wild swings they hear about in terms of what we're doing. But there might be enough there that they can sustain some of their losses. Of course, midterms usually go poorly for the party of the president.
Do any Democrat presidential possibilities stand out to you at this point?
I always say if I know who they are, they're probably not the person. So, I mean, look, I do think a lot of these governors are very interesting. I mean, Pritzker is kind of interesting, which I never thought. I didn't know anything about him. I saw him speak, and I thought he was quite effective. I know many people like Governor Shapiro, Governor Whitmer. I mean, there's a bunch of names where I do think you could, some would, Pete Buttigieg, former Secretary of Transportation. There is an interesting team of kind of middle-aged, accomplished, experienced people. But I always think it's like the person you never see. I mean, it wasn't Reagan who everyone was predicting would inevitably be the nominee. It was George H.W. Bush. It wasn't Obama everyone was predicting. So I kind of want to wait on those predictions. I think the midterms will be very important. I think that's when it really starts to solidify kind of what the issues are going to be and how do people perform. But fortunately for Democrats, they're going to have primaries this time. And you need primaries. There's a function to primaries. You start to sort this out. You start to see what a person looks like, not on one interview on television, but when they're constantly being barraged and they're interacting with each other. So I think Democrats need that. All that has to happen before any predictions kind of seriously can be made.
I have to say, I've been interested in the rising profile and video presence of Mark Kelly of Arizona. Tough-looking, border state senator, former fighter pilot, astronaut. His wife, the wounded ex-Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, is a living embodiment for the gun control movement and a less divisive politics. It looks good on paper, but how does it really...
I don't know. I mean, I just heard an interview with Governor Bashar, who, again, I didn't know much about, and part of me was, as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, the Democratic response is to be as conservative in your selection as possible. Here is a white male governor. But then I heard him, and he was quite compelling, actually. He was very articulate about how to respond to some of the kind of economic policies, and he was very tough, actually, as the moderate. He was interesting, but again, I don't know. Like, one interview does not make a candidate. The brutality, frankly, of the campaign, you know this more than I do. I mean, you've covered this, really does bring out what a person has in them before that general election. And so I think there's a lot of interesting candidates.
Does the New York City primary win of Democrat socialist Zoran Mamdani have a meaningful message for Democrats elsewhere?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think it doesn't mean, because I know there's a lot of certainly opposition to him. So you can take both problems and things people are excited about. So the problems, many people certainly don't agree with some of his stances, certainly don't agree with some of his language, including not his language, but his kind of hesitance to simply say no to the global intifada. So there's issue areas, and certainly a lot of his economic policies, rent freeze, are going to be controversial. On the other hand, so I'm just giving you the both parts. He did attract a lot of younger people, which is interesting. He attracted kind of a multiracial, he didn't win the black vote, but he won a lot of, so there's something there that Democrats should at least be listening to. His communication is quite impressive. Whatever you think of him, he figured out how to use social media on its own terms. It's really interesting. He did man on the street interviews. He thought of the scroll rather than the script, which is the essence of how this stuff works. So Democrats can take something from that, and I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all kind of way to think of party politics. Different areas you can have the Kentucky governor and him as part of the kind of messiness of a party, and that's different than who the national candidate is. So I see kind of both problems, but also some skills that at least tactically Democrats can think about.
On the Republican side, to what degree will the candidate be decided by Trump himself, formally or not?
Even if it's not formal, and I just heard someone say it's going to be Trump himself, always a possibility. I don't discount that at all. But if it's...
Wait, that's saying there'd be an election.
Yeah, I still believe the elections will happen. I heard once on an interview, I think it was Emily Bazelon, I can't remember who does this thing called the Political Gab Fest for Slate, and she said, let's not assume a crisis is going to happen until it happens. And that doesn't mean not to anticipate it, worry about it, prepare, but don't normalize it. Because there's a danger, you talk so much about it, and then it happens and you're almost like, oh yeah, that was happening. It's a point that really stuck with me. So I'm going on the assumption we're having our elections, and I will do everything possible to kind of write and talk about how that can happen and should happen. But in terms of the Republicans, whether he personally selects the candidate, his shadow is so large right now. And look, Trumpism and Republicanism are one and the same. And it doesn't mean he just dominates the parties. I can point to a million issues where he tapped into elements of Republican politics that have been brewing for decades. There's just not a lot of daylight. So I don't think a candidate who wants to win can really break from a lot of this agenda and win. Not because of him just, because that's where the party is. And Look, I said today during an interview, the kind of hard line on immigration is not new. It's been building in the GOP since the 1990s, since Governor Pete Wilson in California pushed in '94 for a very stringent proposition that focused on undocumented immigrants and used very explosive rhetoric that the National Party, not all of them, but more and more have picked up on since the 90s. So you can't break with President Trump's agenda, because President Trump's agenda right now is the Republican agenda.
All right, just a couple more questions from me, then we open it up. You've said before, we certainly haven't seen in Congress any of this roiling and people peeling away from issues like grocery prices, gas prices. I'm amazed about this Jeffrey Epstein thing, because underlying it, one of the possibilities is that Trump himself is soiled by it. Why are these loyalists? Explain that, the whole dissent.
I have no idea. I mean, I know that the kind of conspiracies are very important right now in a lot of Republican political culture, so certainly media culture. It's just part of the currency through which people speak, and the Epstein files and the scandal are part of that. I don't quite get the shifting. I mean, obviously Elon Musk opened this up by saying Trump is in these files. And so there is a defensiveness, although I'm not sure it would really matter given his ability to withstand scandal. But I think the division is, this is one fault line, meaning don't ignore the conspiracy that you yourself have brought to the show. And I think that's what Trump is navigating.
Could Elon Musk's threatened third party and his personal fortune, while not winning, still tilt the race against the Republicans?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I see why. So my next, if any Longview fans, this is my newsletter comes out tomorrow, it's on this. I mean, one answer is the historic answer. Third parties just have a lot of trouble succeeding in this country for various reasons. At best, they're spoilers, such as Ralph Nader in 2000, Ross Perot, 1992. Not a spoiler, but has an influence. Republicans are the anomaly. But I don't know, there's part of me that was thinking this is the kind of heart that Trump, this is exactly what he wants, a foil. Meaning, midterms are, right, for the midterms are about the incumbent. That's why they're so damaging. And I think he is vulnerable, actually, right now. At least the Republicans are vulnerable. You put a Musk party, it wouldn't be Musk running, and nor could he run at any point. He's not a liked person. He's really hated. And I think it would give Trump, this is what he loves. He loves a good foil. And he has a foil with them that he doesn't have with the Democrats, although he'll probably use the candidate for the New York mayor's race as one of them. But I think, I don't know, there's ways in which it could energize Republicans. So I'm not quite sure how this will play out. I don't think it's obvious to me this is a great thing for the Democrats. I think the Democrats need to focus on the basics. They need to really focus on what they did, not be concerned about Musk, but canvassing, candidate recruitment, fundraising. Right now, this is kind of, if you're a Democrat, 5-alarm fire. The midterms are really the last stop before the presidential election and creating a check on presidential power. And I don't know, if they get too wrapped up in that, I'm not sure it's going to work.
All right, last question, long view. What happens to Trump's party after he departs, one way or another? Do any of his leading loyalists have enough TV-tuned charisma, social media charisma, appeal to keep the former Grand Old Party from splintering among all possible successors?
Yeah, I mean, look, I actually think the Republican farm team is not quite as strong as the Democratic one. I do think it's centered now on Trump, and even Vice President Vance doesn't have the same kind of political weight as the president. It's interesting. Governor DeSantis imploded very quickly, but I don't think the party's going to change. I mean, this gets back to the answer earlier. I see a very united Republican Party now. I don't think the issues are, maybe some issues like tariffs.
But I mean after Trump.
Yeah, no, after Trump, I think this is, for at least a while, this is pretty much the playing field if you're a Republican. So it'll be figuring out how to do it in a new way, how to maybe broaden the reach of your candidacy. But this is what Republican politics looks like for the foreseeable
The
future.
toothpaste is not going back in the
No,
tube.
no. This is
Okay, I think we have time. Yvette, yes, for some questions?
And maybe wait for the microphone.
Wait for the microphone.
She's bringing the mic right now.
I don't want to cause marital discord here. Yeah, sure.
You can both
First.
have.
I'd like to suggest that.
Here, they want you to use the
Wait,
mic.
wait.
Whoops, oh, I really probably don't need this.
Behind you.
I'd like to suggest that what's missing, the Democratic Party seems to have disappeared. And I think the reason it has disappeared is because social justices have been solved pretty much around this country. If you go back to the 30s and 40s, when the Democratic Party first grew into a powerful country, we had mass unemployment, we had all kinds of things, we had wars going on,
Everybody was in the same boat.
and everybody was in the same boat. And now, we're almost all in the same boat too. There's a lot of people working and going away for vacations and so on. Our economic situation has changed dramatically. And the Democratic Party has lost one of its major issues. And I think that is probably the reason why it's breaking up. We don't have a strong man or woman who can make, I mean, what's her name? Who ran, but it was that's not a candidate at all. I don't know what she was.
Who?
I can't remember her name.
What?
What was her name?
Pamela.
I'm sorry. You have to excuse me. I'm 100 years old, so my memory is very bad. Excuse me. My memory is bad. I can't remember her name.
What supplements are you taking?
I will tell you some other time.
All right.
But seriously, the Democrats have not run a candidate. Even what's his name? An old man in office. Biden was a very poor president.
Pass the microphone.
Okay, I just wanted to say that is what's missing from this law. The Republicans are never going to be stronger because they don't reach all the people. And the Democrats won't unless they have an issue. Okay.
Okay. As a board member of the League of Women Voters, a traditional nonpartisan organization, quite surprisingly and pleasingly to members that we're it said from the 87 days that Trump has been in office, they even mentioned a name, we are in a constitutional crisis, that the president is not following Supreme Court orders, changing funding from Congress, all of the things. So asking if you feel that is a correct statement.
Okay, so I'll take both, just to keep harmony. I mean, on the first, I hear your point that the point on the candidate, as you heard, there'll be differences on what people thought of Vice President Harris. But on the issues, parties need animating issues. So the question is, are the Democrats lacking that? Have they solved the great social questions that animated the party? Or are there actually issues that for younger generations of voters matter a lot, whether it's reproductive rights, whether it's immigration now, whether it's the climate. These are issues that really do resonate, or the democracy itself. And those all can be issues that you could imagine Democrats kind of raising up. The second question, the only thing I would take a little issue is I don't think he's violating Supreme Court. I think the problem is the Supreme Court is accepting what he's doing. So the crisis, I do believe, we are in a kind of dangerous moment of presidential power. I don't know if I count that as a constitutional crisis. If a president is truly unbound, if the checks and balances are not working, if there are no limitations, essentially, which is where we are on what a president can do, that is not the intention of the Constitution. The Constitution very much as we talked about parties, it's also meant to constrain any single source of power. We don't have that right now. And so I don't know where that ends. And so if you're in that situation, dangerous things can happen. So I don't disagree with that analysis. It's not quite him ignoring the courts, it's the court supporting him, though, that concerns me most.
Well, not a lot of the lower courts.
The federal justices have been really actually quite amazing.
Stand up.
Because it's not simply standing up for principle, they're doing it under grave threat to their families and to themselves, and they're doing it when they understand it's not great, for your future. But the district judges, who the Supreme Court a few weeks ago weakened, because they really don't like these district judges, have been quite interesting. But the Supreme Court, so there is it's ultimately what the Supreme Court does. And does the Supreme Court say anything that Trump says, sorry, I'm not following it? We haven't hit that yet, but it's only because he hasn't had to. He hasn't had to, that's why.
Go ahead.
My older brother, Theodore Loy, you may not have met.
Yes, one of the greatest political scientists ever.
Yeah, well, he, one of his shticks was, he was very strongly in favor of the third party.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious.
I'm sorry, can he hold that
hold
question
on,
just
Mike.
until I get over there?
It's a question about third-party potential.
I speak up pretty loud.
But you're facing,
All right. My question is, getting back to my brother.
who's it?
He's no dummy, but he tried it himself, sponsoring some people long ago. But
What are we talking about?
my brother, Theodore
Lowy is one of the great political scientists.
Yeah, he was a strong guy. But I'm just wondering whether or not the advent of, first of all, Citizens United,
Yep.
and Musk, his efforts now to sponsor a third party, what do you think the prospects are?
Very low. I think, look, there's a reason third parties have done poorly. Not that it's, I understand the desire for it. The Electoral College makes it just really difficult. And the fact is, the two parties, for all their weaknesses, are also very strong organizationally in terms of money and identification. And you have all the famous polls, endless polls, people who say they want an independent party. They don't like the parties. On election day, they vote for their party. And so if you have both of those, I just think it's really hard. I think the only place you see a little movement, and you might still, is in local politics. And that's where both Social Democrats, MAGA, Tea Party Republicans originally gained some traction. But nationally, I just don't think it's in the foreseeable future. I might be wrong, I might be surprised, but the historical record is just really negative on that. We could take a couple if you wanted.
Maybe just to stick to the side to say, is that okay for now?
Whatever you want.
Because they have a question.
Sure.
Just because it's easier to run, it's ready to go.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of Westmore of Maryland.
Oh, yeah.
I'm hoping that he runs, and I'm really fingers crossed that he'll decide to run. But I was curious about Liz Cheney and Christy Todd Whitman. You had Adam Kissinger, all these people. Where are they? And is anyone making any kind of an effort to go against the MAGA cult?
I think those are the reasons no one wants to go against MAGA, meaning you just listed 3 examples of people who did that, and they put their neck out. And last we saw Liz Cheney, she was with Vice President Harris, actually, campaigning. I don't think there's room for those Republicans in the party right now. And I don't know, maybe this Elon Musk party's trying to reach out to them, or maybe there's some effort, but I think their fate, your question actually answers itself. There's just no room for that right now. And I don't even think anyone wants to dare to do that, in part because of what happened to them. I mean, Congresswoman Cheney is a very conservative Republican who fit pretty well in the party, and she has been banished, purged, and removed from Red America.
You suggested
that part of our problems would be solved by increasing the size of Congress. And I'm thinking, why in the world would anybody from New York agree to increase the number of representatives from Idaho or vice versa? Why would any small state,
Yeah.
more importantly, agree?
Well, there's different ways in which it can be done, and it can still be apportioned by population, obviously. It doesn't mean making it a Senate. So you're not talking about just vastly increasing how many members Wyoming has randomly. It has to be connected. There would still be fears, not because of what you're saying, but some power, a lot of power has moved out of states like New York and towards Sunbelt states, and so they would, a state like Texas could see its numbers increase. But it's not an argument, I'm not arguing it from the perspective of what's better for one party or the other, one state or the other. The argument is what would make the institution work better. I believe in the end, that is the kind of thinking that gets us to a better politics. Otherwise, it's a perpetual trap where no one wants to do anything because you're worried at the margins it's going to give the other party power. But it can be done, so it would be done. It would never be done in a way in the House that kind of reflects the quirks or problems or idiosyncrasies of the Senate, however you want to think of it.
The man with the microphone.
We all know that the first job of a politician is to get reelected. So I think the problem is, and you touched on it, is follow the money. And the problem is, that's our problem. It's too expensive. You have to give up too much of your own self. And I don't see how, unless Congress will do its job, that we're ever going to get out of this problem unless you do something about the money issue.
Well, so yes, I agree, and that's part of the book. But we've had moments, look, I just look historically, we've had moments where that exact fear and concern is actually broken. So our campaign finance system is actually not static. It's changed over time. In the early 20th century, you had disclosure reforms, which were quite significant. Now they seem irrelevant, but where we ended up knowing much more about where money's coming from than we had in the past. And in the 1970s, the Watergate reforms of '74 are very substantive. From the creation of a federal election committee to contribution limits, which before then didn't exist. There was nothing like that. To the public finance system I talked about, which it didn't last forever, but it lasted for a while. So we have had moments we've responded, and even since then, you had the McCain-Feingold reform on soft money, which was not irrelevant. So I think it's important not to you have hit on a very important problem, but I still believe reform is possible. I can't tell you when. It's usually under circumstances of scandals that shake the system and show the dysfunction in a way that is so immense, even incumbents want to do something. But I don't think it's impossible that can happen. Even with small campaign donations, which David and I talked about, you do actually have seen many states shift to that as part of their system. And so we've made progress on small donations, which I don't think is irrelevant. Doesn't mean we are even close to fixing it. And finally, the Supreme Court decision was devastating. And I think that's room where Congress needs to kind of enact legislation that stops the endless flow of big money.
Does the changing media system, the fact that the networks are going out of business, that there's so much more local, diffuse, widespread sources, mean that big money isn't as critical anymore, and that audiences are self-selecting around points of view? The internet provides means to organize movements, in a way that the parties had a sole handle on. It may be too early, but the whole system is changing so that maybe influence can come
It's a very astute point, and David, of course, is touching on something a lot of people have been writing about recently. There's a good book by Chris Hayes of MSNBC. Can't remember the Siren song, I think, and it's about attention. And the whole argument is that politics isn't about money anymore. I don't actually agree. I think money's still very important. You can't run a campaign based on a tweet. As good as you are, you still do need the money. That said, I think you're touching on something important, that the commodity in politics, he argues, is not simply how much you can raise and how much you can spend. It's can you command attention in this really rapid changing world for what you want to talk about. And that's very difficult because it's a media system where the premium is everyone's competing for this attention. And so I think that is a space which ironically might loosen up some of the power of money. We're seeing that. I mean, look, back when Trump was first elected, money was not everything. And he found ways to win without the same kind of money as others. And you're seeing that in some congressional races.
In a way, didn't he shift politics from issues and interests to a kind of a continuous entertainment? I mean, his skill was capturing attention.
It's a skill.
He learned it.
Yeah.
He learned it, as the phony host of a phony competition, and he can change his point of view, which he has done. But he has a commanding presence and an appeal to attention, which is sort of outside the realm of politics.
I mean, I think that is true, and I think that is his skill. I still think issues matter. I mean, when he went up that elevator and he announced that it was glitz and it was entertaining and it was
Down the escalator.
Down the escalator, but he brought immigration up first thing, and he has a sense of the issues that matter. There was no way he was going to break from this extension of the tax cut. He gets that supply side tax cuts are very important. And I do think that's another part of his skill. But the first part is obviously relevant.
Going back to local politics and the New York City mayoral election, New York is a big party of third parties. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's the point. That's a space where you can see the room that in national politics might not exist, but does actually exist in both local and state politics for third-party movement. He defeated someone who was very well-financed, former Governor Cuomo.
And well-known.
And he did it through media, meaning so there's also, you can kind of see all that. So I think New York is one example, probably one of the biggest, probably in California too, where at the local level you see some of that. Ultimately, I think those ideas get absorbed by the national parties.
But how does that play out with all of those third-party candidates on the ballot?
Oh, you mean in the general election?
Yeah.
All of them, meaning Cuomo and Adams?
Cuomo and Adams are...
My instinct is they split the vote, and Cuomo today doubled down. So my instinct is they split the vote and he wins. But I don't know, I don't really know where it's all going. I don't know what the Republican Party is going to do. I don't know if both Adams and Cuomo are going to seriously be in it to the end. But obviously, just on paper, the Democratic Party is the party of New York City. It just has organizational strength. It's hard to break. It's breakable. Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor Giuliani, there's Republican mayors. But Lindsay, but it is very strong. He won by a commanding kind of vote, first round. So the question is, if you have a split, it's not just do you have many parties, you have one, the alternative parties. I don't think Curtis Sliwa is going to put a big challenge on that. I shouldn't say that because who knows anymore, but I'm putting that aside. If you split the other major opponent, it's going to help. It's going to help the kind of Democratic ticket. So I think that's how it's going to play out. But let's see, because it's a very dynamic moment, and there's many interests that are lining up against the Democratic ticket at this point, formidable ones. So I don't know, but I think that is the question structurally of how it plays out.
I think we're just about out of time now. It's 7:30. So let me repeat my thanks to Professor Zelizer.
Thank you, everyone. Great question.
So with that, and all the folks at Rogers Memorial Library, and again to all of you here and those watching later. Good night and
Good luck to all of us.